Everyone. This is the graphic design principles review. It will help support your assignment 2, which is to identify the graphic design principles in the public sphere. And it will also recap the in-class activity from last week. If you've already gone through these PDFs on e-learning, then you might recognize some of the graphics that we're going to go over. So just like the interior design elements and principles that we discussed, graphic design also has elements and principles as well. So why are we talking about graphic design? This is interior design. There are graphic design programs. What's the difference? How are they the same? There is a big difference, of course. You don't want to be an interior designer and think that you are a graphic designer and vice versa. However, interior designers basically do design graphics, but in more of a three-dimensional sense. And we also do two-dimensional graphics, such as environmental wayfinding, different types of signages, and sometimes we collaborate with specific designers. There is a profession called environmental graphic design, and it is essentially the marriage of graphic design with interior design. And they study the psychology of how people move through space and how they can use graphic design and spatially to help people move through space more effectively, based on needs, based on the space it is. If it's an airport, or is it a hospital, is it a library, all different kind of culture and vibes in each space. So it really does take a trained designer of that special discipline to approach those topics. And so I'm hoping that this lecture and this assignment will not only help you build your knowledge of interior design and just looking at space and evaluating space, but I'm hoping that maybe it will tell you, are you really passionate about environmental graphics? Or maybe you're not. It really helps. Each assignment helps an individual get more exposure to the different aspects of the profession. And so a lot of interior designers also have to incorporate branding in their work. So when you think of a hotel that maybe has signature colors or logos or shapes, or even, a style, all of that comes into play in the design. So there are collaborations between graphic designers and interior designers in creating those spaces. So there's a lot of overlap, but they are their own discipline, and they have their own expertise and specialty that they can bring to that partnership. So let's see. I'm just making it bigger. I'm trying to scroll through the pages. There we go. Okay. So we've talked a lot about this two-dimensional and three-dimensional. I think we all have an idea of what is 2D and what is 3D. But in a more professional sense, three-dimensional design includes architecture, interior design, and product design. And there's many more, but those are 3 that will overlap with what we do the most. I like to call it spatial design, because we are designing physical and psychological experiences, regardless if we're an architect or a product designer or an interior designer or a furniture designer or industrial designer, a textile designer. Each discipline shares the same principles. So that is critical. So on the the first lecture that was 3 hours long, there was a slide that listed all these different design elements and principles, and then we circled a select few to talk about for interior design, but really all of those apply to interior design and others, some more than others. So, well, architecture and like this three-dimensional building might not be something that somebody that works in 2D does, but they do have the same principles like scale and proportion and everything that we've been studying. So, you probably notice that a lot of the things you've been looking at, like composition and unity, you may have already read about those things in terms of graphic design, but now we're looking at them spatially. Two-dimensional design. So there's two-dimensional design regardless of what field you're in. It's and I've said this a few times, but this is like the most challenging part of design, is that we have an idea in our head. It all starts with that idea. And we need to translate that to paper so then somebody else can read it and interpret it, essentially. So we have this abstract thing that maybe not even words can articulate, but then we have to put it through a mental process, enable for us to actually like go through our hands and draw it. And then another person would read that, and there's a filter right there, and then it goes through their brain and gets interpreted. And then perhaps they, maybe if they're a builder, then they have to design shop drawings or buildings. So two-dimensional design is really critical for three-dimensional design. And it often is a big part of that idea generation and in the design process. So there are 4 basic graphic design principles, and there are some extra ones that we'll talk about at the end, but these are the 4 basics, and we focused on these in the in-class activity last week, and they are proximity, alignment, contrast, and repetition. So last week I did not really give a definition or an explanation of what these words mean. Some may think that they are self-explanatory, but the in-class activity was to sort of measure what these things mean to each individual. And when we laid our drawings out, we could easily see that, proximity to one person means something different than another. And people see alignment differently. So we'll start with proximity. Basically, items relating to each other should be grouped close together. And I'm hesitant to say the word should because there's no prescribed right or wrong answer for any of this. But I say should because if we're talking about communication and how to get information across to other people, the should, group related items together is based on the fact that that's what works historically. So when several items are in close proximity to each other, they become a unit rather than several separate units. So even if you're far away and you can't read the text or see the graphics, if say like multiple things are grouped into 3 sections, you could see that there's 3 sections going on. And so your brain starts to figure out which one you've taken first, second, and third. And it really helps us organize information and not only reduces aesthetic clutter, but it reduces, this is going to sound crazy, it reduces the clutter and noise in our head. And yes, we do have clutter and noise in our head. So just like items should be grouped together if they're related, if they're not related, they shouldn't be in close proximity. And then the closeness or lack of closeness indicates the relationship. And so this is all based on research in psychology. People associate, the word associate, people even naturally just group things together. So graphic design, just like interior design, any type of design, is a reflection of humanity and society. So the fact that we're studying this and I'm telling you this shouldn't, it's all based on science. Uh, Granted, science is something that should always be challenged and explored even more so we can keep evolving. So there's always more research to be had, new ideas, and further innovation in the field. So just because I'm telling you these things, I'm not prescribing them to you. You might find an instance in the public realm where things are not related, but they are grouped together, and you feel that it works and it's doing its job and it's effective, and that's great. So the main part about that is that you capture it and you create a good argument for why it works. And maybe it's because you watched people interact with that. We should all be, when we're out looking at these things, we should look to see how people around us interact with these graphic design elements in the world. All right, so here's an example. You may have heard of the Redwood County Forestry. What's happening in the Redwood County Forestry? Let's find out. So the example on the top was provided in class, and it is what is off about it, and I let everybody choose what they felt was off about it. I did not give any indication. However, what's happening in is more closely related to Redwood County Forestry. They actually create a sentence, but University of the West is more of a label, and it's actually mirrored. If you go on the right side, it says cooperative extension. So University of the West and cooperative extension should be together, because those, those are like the location and the event. But what's happening in Redwood County Forestry is essentially the title of the event. So at the bottom here, this is an example of a redesign. So what's happening in Redwood County Forestry has been, rearranged so that it's proximity, it's close to one another, and the same with University of the West and cooperative extension. However, Redwood County Forestry also became more bold, and the trees became larger, and that may just draw a person's eyes right to that and provides a line through the sign. So there's a top and a bottom, essentially, and so there's the name of the event, and then at the bottom it's the event details. Again, we looked at these. So what's wrong with these cards? Hard to tell if you were thinking that Toad Hall is the name of the person whose business card this is, but Toad Hall is the business. And so you can see why this, doesn't necessarily make sense, because Toad Hall has an address, and it's 916 Old River Road in Red River, New Mexico. And then Riley Pickett has contact information, which is his phone number. But you can't really tell, because Riley Pickett, the phone number, the street address, and like the city and state are all on the corners in both scenarios, regardless of what's bold or not. And so it's really hard to tell what's supposed to go with what. And our eyes don't naturally want to read that information like this. So when you think about when you get something in the mail and you see your name, your street address, the city, the state, the zip code, and sometimes there's even like a and then it's the topic or more information. That's how we logically take in information. The same with days and months and years. It builds on each other. So here's a redesign. Now it is centrally aligned and it's using proximity. So now Toad Hall and Riley Pickett are close to one another, and the address and contact information are close to one another. What do you think about that? Toad Hall is still really big, still really bold. It's kind of, you still don't really know what you're looking at. Let me go back. So, as we mentioned in class, there is no right or wrong. Personally, even though this is a redesign and it does make way more sense than the last example, I'm not sold on this design. So we just talked about center alignment. So now let's talk about alignment. Just like the business card, nothing should be placed on the page just randomly or arbitrarily, which means without purpose. We use the word arbitrary a lot in design when we feel like a design decision that's been made is arbitrary. So it's not thought out, it's maybe just there for decoration, or it just really doesn't have a purpose, and you will be questioned on it. Why is this wall here? Why is this like this? You always want to have a reason. But back to alignment. And maybe alignment is your reason. So in thinking about a page, alignment, again, nothing should be placed arbitrarily. And it felt like in the business card, the information that was on the 4 squares or the 4 corners was arbitrary. There's no reason why they were placed that way. They could be mixed up and it would still read the same. But every element should have a visual connection with another element on the page. So it creates, and when this is clean, sophisticated look, again, that just means that it's streamlined. The way that we read it is streamlined visually. So it's the person who created that page had to translate from their head the design on the page, to which then we have to translate through our eyes into our head and understand. So there's a lot of filtering and translations taking place, a lot of opportunity for miscommunication. And so that's, using these design principles ensures that we can have better communication. So back to the business card. So we just basically removed the center alignment and gave everything a right alignment. And so it says there's an invisible line that runs down here connecting the text. You may see this without this alignment line and think that, it's right aligned. But you might not realize the impact of that invisible space after the line. Because the information isn't all the way up. There's a border, and that border creates an arrangement on the page that's more than just the words are on the right and nothing's on the left. Yes, okay. So when I first saw this, I'm like, I didn't even know what I was looking at. And you probably don't either. I mean, there's some indication here. But when you see it like this, it makes sense. It's like a bus schedule. So when you go back, you see, okay, these are all the routes that are going to Knoxville, Tennessee, and the departure and arrival times and the cost. But when it's like this, it makes a little bit more sense. So they've separated it by departs, arrives, and flight. Okay, maybe not flight, but maybe it's not bus. It's transportation. And this is how, when you're in an airport or a bus station, you see information like this, and it usually moves fast. It's moving on the page because there's so much information that it cycles through all of the departures and arrivals, and we're used to that. That's how we read information. So if you were to, think, I want to do something new and creative, think about the impact that would have on somebody that's late for their plane, is trying to figure out where they need to go, and they look up and it's this new creative layout that they've never seen before, and they have to take the time to figure out how to read it and what it's saying. Because there is a learning curve to when you look at things. All right, you may remember this one, Red Hen Enterprises. On the left-hand side, that's what we started with in class. They say this is a typical report cover, yes? Perhaps. I mean, and I think a lot of, papers get turned in that is like center aligned, and I think growing up, we're kind of taught to do that. But in design school, we move it around a little bit because we understand there's easier ways for people to take information in and read your page. And so the redesign on the right is an example of one of those. What do you think? I mean, when you look at one, how do you take it in? Nothing's been changed in terms of boldness and size. It's just the alignment. So now we have contrast. So this contrast can actually help all of them. So it can really help determine proximity and alignment. So you want to avoid elements on the page that are too similar. And a way to do that is by providing contrast. So it could be, the typeface, which is another way of saying font. It could be the color, the size, line weights, shape, etc. If they're not the same, then they shouldn't be the same. You should make them different, but not so different that they don't seem like they're not supposed to be on the same page together. So maybe it's not changing all of the typefaces, but maybe making some italicized and some bold, or maybe different colors. One thing in terms of contrast is when you write in all caps, it's this is going to be interesting because we're talking about all caps now in intro, and for those who are in design communication, we're talking about architectural lettering, which is very uniform all caps. So in graphic design, you want to avoid all caps because it's hard for people to read. There's no shape. So when you're standing back, it just looks like rows of text. And for graphic design purposes, it's really easy to lose the meaning of what you're trying to say. So I know when I look at this sentence, all caps are hard to read. My eyes naturally go to this because, just simply because there's a dashed line there. It makes my eyes feel better because there's no break right here. But mixed case sentences have almost a pattern, a redundant shape that makes them easier to read. So it gives a little bit more information in the letters that our brains already understand. And our brains understand that capitals start a sentence. So it's just easier for people to understand, especially in different languages. So here's an example. You can see that all the caps just form a rectangle, but mixed case sentences have ascenders and descenders, which creates a pattern. If you were to write a paper and then and then do outlines similar to this and remove your words, you would end up with a new language. It would become a pattern, a font of its own. So avoid all caps. If you don't believe me, this sentence has just the same number of letters as the previous one. So the all cap statement at the top is the exact same size as the bottom. And you can tell the difference in how you're taking in the information. So here's some examples of all of those mixed together. We received on the board the another newsletter, and I asked what feels off about this. There was a lot of things. There's nothing wrong, it's all like accurate, but it's not the best it can be. So in this redesign on the right hand side, they added a bold around the title of the newsletter, and then they made more contrast between the headlines. And in fact, they added hierarchy in the contrast. So exciting headlines are a little bit larger, but the thrilling and boring subheads are smaller. Those are very, very subtle. You might not have even noticed it because when you look at this, you see 4 sections. But really, when you look at it even more, you can see which areas you should read first. And that is an example of repetition where you see the larger, go back. You see the larger headline, smaller, larger, smaller. So that is probably something that can be carried throughout the whole newsletter. And it becomes another pattern. And then we associate it with meeting. So here's some example of repetition with dear old Riley Pickett. When you get to the end of the information, does your eye just wander off the card? Or now that you really what happened here is that Toad Hall stayed the same, but the phone number is now bold, and it actually is now framing the card. So as a whole composition, the card stands alone, and we process this a little different. If you're here, all you really look at is Toad Hall. That's your focal point, but down here, the repetition allows you to go important, medium important, important. I know somebody in class this week decided to put the phone number for Ancient City right next to Ancient City because that was like the important part of it. And so it's an example of this as well. The phone number and Toad Hall were in bold to provide contrast because they're similar, and then the information in the middle is similar per this card design. Here's another example of red hen. And then a resume. We did not cover a resume in class, but graphic design of resumes is actually really important. So usually you see a resume with somebody's name in the middle with their contact information a little smaller underneath it. And then you see their information provided with like bold and enlarged headings. That's fairly typical. But here's a way to improve it. So now you have the repetition and contrast of the lines going across. And so it's really grouping that information together. And it's drawing. So now, I'm looking at this resume of 2 seconds. Okay, Laura Matthews, education, boom. As opposed to before, it's not bold enough and it doesn't stand out enough for like that instantaneous look. And a lot of the times, education is first or it's last, depending on the job and the scenario. People rearrange these things. So there's no prescribed order to how you should provide the information. And so really making it clear where the headings are is a way that, somebody reading this could really easily see this. And then here, if you'll notice, there's only the bold headings and the body text, we'll call it. But here we have the bold headings, the lines, and then we have those subheadings of the job titles and then the description. And so it provides another level of information. You know, remember big to small or small to big. That's how we take in information. Here's a sign for a concert series. It looks like it's the lineup. So February 8 at 8 p.m. These are all the people playing. And then there's Friday, March 1. And I'm taking this in, so I have to look because the dates, for a second, I thought this was just the playlist for the night, but it actually has different dates. It's more of a schedule. Okay, so here's another, redesign of it. Now we see that the events are organized, by the, type of show as opposed to the date. The date is still in order. However, the title of the show is made larger. So you want people to take in information based on the most important information you have, which would be, the Alexander String Quartet. Okay, what does that include? And then where is it? And when is it? As opposed to, okay, what's on February 8? Okay, what's on March 1? So it's just, think about the way you want people to take in information when you relay it. Perhaps you wanted them to read by the dates. Here's Ancient City. Here's that mailer. This is crazy. I mean, when I look at this, I see like every Napa Valley or, I don't know, whatever postcard comes in the mail from used car shops, anything like that. So obviously Ancient City Tile Interiors sounds a little more high class than the hardware store that's having a blowout sale at the end of the road. And so how can we make it look different from those? There's a ton of information. This is a problem that happens with every single one. But the problem is that those stores don't really have graphic designers, but they have somebody that knows how to use the software. So here's an example of a revised way. So one of the questions we kept asking was, is tile and interior a part of Ancient City in its name, or is it not? So in this case, I'm reading that it is Ancient City Tile and Interiors. And then there's Santa Ana's Interior Headquarters. So interior headquarters are located around the country. We have the Michigan Design Center. And so if you're a designer or somebody in the trade, that means a lot. So clearly they are marketing this to the trade, to people who would know what interior headquarters means. But then underneath it, they have contractors' prices to the public and installation available. So you can see they're really wanting, professionals, but they also, you can go in there, you can buy stuff. You don't need to be a professional. They'll help you. But it makes you feel like it's a more sophisticated event when you go in there as just like a homeowner looking for tile for your bathroom. You're like, oh, there's going to be interior designers. It's going to be a showroom. This is the headquarters, as opposed to this is a blowout sale, on the main suburban highway. And then they've listed all of their types of tiles. They've aligned it, and they've aligned it with the drawing of the tiles. And then they put the number really big and bold. So it might not be in proximity to Ancient City, but it is the same like big and boldness as ancient city. So our eyes take those two things in together and we associate them together. They also added credit card logos. I don't know if you've ever been in a country that you didn't speak the language and you wanted to buy something and you saw those little logos and you knew like, okay, good, my card will work here. Usually, you know, in the United States, it's assumed that Visa and MasterCard will be taken everywhere. Not always, but you never know what the case is anywhere else you go. So the symbols, even, like, they didn't even say they offered those. The symbols, we know that means they offer those. Here's one that we hadn't looked at before, the construction network, remodel and repair specialists, residential and commercial. Okay. They've put those two in proximity and they're in all caps. Everything's in all caps. There's a lot of stars. The stars kind of pop out for me. And I'm analyzing this as just somebody looking at this. So let's see what could have been done better about this. Okay, so they got rid of the border that had all of the stars, which somebody could have argued that's contrast. But they've made the construction network much larger. It's no longer all capitals. So that is contrast as well, where we're seeing the ascenders and descenders. And then again, we have large, medium, smaller, smaller, and then large again, because that's the contact information. You're starting to see a pattern of how phone numbers and the name of the business or the person are associated with each other on a page. Oh boy. I don't even think I need to go into an explanation about this. Oh well, that's a big difference than what we just saw. Yeah, so they've added a different typeface that represents the event a little more. Even though the information's not changing, the typeface and the size of the information makes it, it reinforces the style and feel of the event. And they've added groupings of different information. So here, this is all about admissions. This is about their charity. This is the event, the main event information. And this is more like a teaser contextual. This, never before in Galleria history. I would be very curious to go to this event now. Yeah. Galleria Wine and Chile Fiesta. Ooh. All right, a typical report. What goes around comes around. Lessons from Hitchhiking Across the Country by Robin Williams. That didn't age well. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't laugh about that, but I was not expecting Robin Williams. So here is a redesign that's, it's going through, oh boy. Here's the original with proximity, with alignment, with repetition, and with contrast. Do you have a preference? See, there's no right or wrong. I actually, this one, they don't have the date listed. And for me, if it's a report, then I think the date is important, especially if it's something that somebody might be citing. So here we have the date. So this, if you just wanted to cite this, you could remember this. And even if you don't remember the name of the report, you might remember this information a little bit more. Okay, so at the beginning we talked about the basics and then there were some extras, and here they are. They're movement, balance, emphasis, and unity. So just like the interior design elements and principles, as you know, how elements help achieve the principles, and the principles work towards achieving the design concept. So now we have the four we just went over, supporting movement, balance, emphasis, and unity. So movement is the use of lines, color, and repetition to create the illusion of motion. And by illusion, it could also be like like invisible illusion, like emotional, like you feel it or you just interpret it that way. So here's an example with the lines in the water here. You can easily tell that the bird is moving. Maybe it's just flown into the water. If you think about this, if it were like a stone, you would see that same spiral shape in like multiple little areas as it skips out, and you would see the those lines kind of getting smaller as it goes out. Then there's balance. So it's the act of basically taking two or more things and using contrast or proximity to achieve balance. You could use white space, you could use filled space, that's contrast. You could use text and images, color, no color. So balance really is a compositional thing since it needs to have all of the elements involved. So usually there's three different types of balance. There's symmetry, asymmetry, and radial. So with symmetry, you could have horizontal symmetry, vertical symmetry, diagonal. I think we're all very familiar with things that are symmetrical. So would you say that this was symmetrical? I'm not talking this one and this one. I'm talking, they're each their own. So on the left-hand side, if you were to cut that blue line and divide this in half, they actually are symmetrical. And you could do that diagonally, you could do it along the y-axis, anywhere in between. And the same on the right-hand side, if you were to cut up the middle, you have a symmetrical element on both sides. If you were to cut this way, though, it's no longer symmetrical. So not everything is perfect symmetrical, but here are some examples. So this pencil, obviously, one end has an eraser and one end has the lead tip, but it's symmetrical on the page in terms of balanced. And same with the butterfly. So then there's asymmetrical. I thought this would add a little flavor to the presentation. We still have the pencil, we still have the eraser and the tip, but it's no longer on a 45-degree angle. Now, if we were to cut it in half and look at it, we're seeing things that are a little asymmetrical, but it's still balanced. It's just not a perfect mirroring of the image. And same with this eggplant. You see that the bottom of the eggplant, that's more purple and wider. Even though the top does not have that, it does have something that's contrasting with it. It has the stem, which is green and yellow. And so together, these are all complementary colors and it balances. So most of the weight is on the left-hand side, but this is visually contrasting enough to provide asymmetrical balance. And then here's radial balance. So radial basically means circle or like a radius. If you were to cut these in half along the y-axis, they would be the same. And then we have unity. So a lot of things could make unity. In this instance, it's using balance of composition, of color, and like creating a harmonious effect. So if I were to ask you, what focus is the message? What would you say? It's interesting because there could be a few. And here we go with emphasis. You want to really hone in on what something you want to bring the focal point to that one specific point. So they brought it to what I'm assuming is the sun for solar mapping. What message is stressed here? So we have really three colors. We have black, white, and then the orange, which actually has more darker red around the edges, and it gets lighter as you get to the middle. So it's really drawing you where that O would be. Even though the location of the sun or the symbol on the page is very asymmetrical, and it creates the illusion that the solar mapping is closer to the top than the bottom. We are also working with the fact that it's all uppercase, which we know can be hard to read. So the sun, the fact that it's larger and it overlaps with other letters provides that relief to our eyes. And that is the last slide in this presentation about graphic design principles. There are also universal design principles, and they go hand in hand. And so a part of your assignment too was to include commentary on universal design as expressed through the graphic design principles. So stay tuned for the next lecture in the series all about the 7 principles of universal design.